Okay, good afternoon all. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Sampi and this is a presentation on the anti-representation movement in arts. I'm sure we can all remember when this study came out during COVID lockdowns and sent artists into a frenzy, as does most things on the internet these days. This study seems to suggest that artists are now seen as a non-essential worker in the eyes of the general public. But I think if you knew much about the art world, you can hardly contest this sentiment. If you took the study in, say, the heyday of Da Vinci, I think it would have yielded a much different result. So what happened exactly? As an artist myself, having exhibited a few pieces here and there in gallery shows, I think you can tell based on the eye test that laymen without art theory knowledge feel befuddled by what they're seeing. Art has seen some changes over the past 120 years that has alienated the masses. I think it can best be described as a movement away from representation and towards pure conceptual contemplation.
That's right.
There isn't a meaning somewhere else.
No, the meaning is
Why not?
Is what we see.
Most people want there to be a meaning somewhere else and a picture that refers to it.
Oh, there is. Well, there's the meaning of the experience of seeing it, because when you see it, well, you hopefully you would have you would feel good.
I'm also aware that it's a whopping cliche to reduce conceptual art as being mere nihilistic drivel. Whilst I'm not as Hindenburgian about it as someone from the Art Renewal Center, I think it's undeniable that there's a dominant trend here. Most people will not front up to you that there are nefarious mechanisms in place ensuring that the art world stays this way. So hopefully my presentation gives you a different perspective that goes beyond just the camera having been invented at one point. For those of you who are not fine artists, I hope that this presentation will be of interest to you as well, as many of these myths trickle out from academia and into the common parlance, generating this overall impression that the artist, or the creative in general, has to operate in this manner and therefore is no longer deserving of as much respect. I will begin with a sketch of the philosophical developments that led us down this path, talk you through the major art pieces in this run, give you a rebuttal to the central thesis in contemporary art, and lastly, a message of hope to artists. We begin in the Enlightenment, where man, being thought of as a rational thinking creature, reached a summit. For a species that largely operated on a religious belief in God up until this point, this was a difficult period to take for many, as scientific advances battered a lot of what we used to think about the world, be it the Copernican revelation that we were not at the center of the universe to Darwin, the revelation that we weren't this exceptional species compared to other animals, but rather were animals ourselves, to much later down the line with Freud, where even free will was being contested by the notion that there are irrational and dormant forces governing what we did with ourselves. Thinkers of the time could see what was happening to religion and didn't like what they were seeing. Desperate pivots were made all the time to preserve the idea of a god. Immanuel Kant makes the most crucial move as it relates to contemporary aesthetics discussions. Think of this diagram as how epistemology was naively thought of back then. This is a fancy philosophical term for how we knew what we knew. It is the study of knowledge. You have your subjective internal state and your objective external reality. Through engaging with the external, with your empiricism, your reason, your rationality, you come to know the facts about the world. Kant says that these facts will always be slanted into your subjective experience, that even what we come to know as facts are merely contingent to the calculations used to suss them out. So for example, 2 plus 2 only equals 4 because we've nominally created the concepts of 2s and 4s, and what we come to know as universal truths turn out all the time to be subjectivist or social constructs. The objective reality can't ever really be known. So what was then of great interest to his aesthetics were these pure feelings that can be evoked with a disinterest to phenomena, the kinds of pleasures that can be elicited regardless of your social conditioning and subjectivist disposition. This was called the sublime, and it would dominate proceedings in the art world from here on out, especially during the Romantic art movement, where we as a species responded to the continued and accelerated outgrowth of technology and industrialization through renewed interest in nature and that which transcended the constructed and inorganic, be it in the depiction of a wreckage that reminded one of one's own mortality or in the beauty and order of nature, all represented in natural naturalistic form for now, or represent it at all for that matter. Nietzsche would accuse Kant, Hegel, and German philosophers in general of making these sleight of hand moves to preserve the idea of a god. Indeed, by Kant saying that the objective reality was out there but we can't ever get to it, this was effectively saying that we can't ever say if God was real or not. Hegel is not even satisfied with this. He comes along and says that our subjective slanting of objective reality is the objective reality. Hegel felt that Kant was too trapped in the Aristotelian belief that if something was contradictory, it meant that it was unreasonable and therefore impossible. There were loads of contradictions in the Christian Bible that gave Christianity a battering during the Enlightenment. So by changing the definition of reason altogether to encompass contradiction and dialectic, Hegel attempted to salvage these Christian mythologies. Nietzsche could see what these philosophers were doing and declares that it is too late and futile, famously saying that God is dead and we have killed him. And he doesn't just mean this in a purely literal sense about whether or not God was real, but rather that our ability to believe things, our belief in belief, was now in jeopardy. A lot of our metaphysics stem from a religious structure. Think of the Cartesian pitfall. This is the idea that you can doubt anything. We've all fallen for this pitfall. I can't prove to you that the Earth still stands tomorrow. A meteorite might be headed our way unbeknownst to me. I can't even prove that any of you are real beyond being figments of my imagination, because buttons are being pushed as I'm plugged into the matrix or some unfathomable structure like that. In the final analysis, many things are a matter of faith, including even our Enlightenment belief that human beings were making progress or that we had a moral structure, or even science. Scientists do science because they believe that at the end of their discoveries, the world can be made into a better place. It's a matter of faith. Faith kept these nihilistic impulses in check, and once that got crippled, with the sense that we maybe weren't living in this bell epoch good period, that even our notions of good or bad moral behaviors have been contingent to subjectivist slantings, then why should I play by somebody else's facts then? All of a sudden everything was up for grabs in the present moment as we got this disquiet and desperate scramble that eventually resulted in catastrophes. If our reality is this chaotic swirl and debilitatingly confusing, then we shouldn't depict it in the beautiful forms of the Renaissance. This is most aptly put by poet Philip Larkin in saying, "Irresponsible exploitations of technique is a contradiction to human life as we know it. If not this disquiet being depicted, then at least a foregrounding of the subjectivist experience over all else, regardless of what icon is being depicted." These are some light studies of the ruined cathedral by Claude Monet, where once the church was considered the most important thing in the earthlier planes, it was now a mere object to be slanted into your narrative gaze as opposed to you slanting into it. And there were multiple perspectives that needed to be abided by, most famously posited by the Cubists. Here are paintings by Braque and Cézanne with a quote from each. "This is what I see" becomes "is this what I see?" The same subject seen from different angles gives a motif of the highest interest, and so varied that I think I can be occupied for months without changing my place. Technological advances were also a major influence. The Eiffel Tower had just been built in 1889, and that was the highest man-made structure of the time. That, alongside the advent of air travel and higher-rise buildings being made, meant that we were seeing the roofs of houses for the first time and having our perceptual expectations permanently altered. There no longer was just one set canonical view of the world. With the privileging of the subjectivist experience and everything being up for deconstruction now to be seen for what it really is, what you can still say is that you could tell a whole lot about these artists based on what they choose to paint and deconstruct. Whilst the artists may say that you can't make any value judgments, when you paint something, you're signaling to the world that that's worth painting instead of something else. It's still a value judgment. And so I think it's super telling that women suddenly became the target of modernist ire, to be uglified iconoclastically against the Greco-Roman tradition. Picasso takes it a step further by using aesthetics from an African head mask he acquired to create these connotations of savagery, which also shows, again with technological advancements, allowing trade routes to be opened up. De Kooning is another notorious one for making basically a career out of this kind of endeavor. This is a piece from a series literally just titled Woman. This is a common modernist theme where deeply seated fears were explored through plugging into the modes of othering. You saw that in Metropolis, where technophobia was displaced upon this feminine-looking android. Here with Max Ernst, it's the fear of war, of being bombed, taking the shape of the female form. Here with George Friedrich Grosk of Berlin, he had a tendency of painting prostitutes as the poison maiden, the sign of society gone awry. It was a castration anxiety that did not go away with societal attitudes changing on their own, but rather with penicillin being invented. So as much as these artists want to hide behind subjectivity and state that even science can't cause a dent in the objective realm, science was going about its business regardless of other people's ignorance. So real life is often disappointing compared to the myth, and the general sense that technology had sucked the soul out of proceedings was a prevalent one. These modernists depicted the truth in their different rationales and focuses, but what they all shared was this general tilt away from the audience and towards the self. John Dewey predicted a rise in narcissism amongst artists as industrialization happened and the artist's work was further removed from society. The artists will start privileging their self-pleasure over their original mandate to gratify an audience, eventually gallivanting on their separateness and exaggerating their eccentricity for the sake of identity actualization, which is exactly what you're seeing today. So far, we've seen a fading of representation as a means to gratify an audience, but soon you'll see even the content becomes totally masturbatory and petulantly iconoclastic. Enter professional shitposter Marcel Duchamp in his piece The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors, even. This is a deliberate parody of the scientific invention made with no discernible science or function. It is an anti-art object without a use. In unscrambling the notes he wrote whilst making this is supposed to be what he's representing. Up top is a bride undressing herself, and trapped below are a bunch of bachelors with no means of getting to her, so they take out their sexual frustrations through endlessly masturbating. Now, if you were to read this piece kindly, I suppose you can say that this is a revolt against the taboos of masturbation. Masturbation wasn't something the state or the parent could stop you from doing, not easily at least, and thus it was a revolt against the idea that somebody else had to pleasure you, and therefore also a revolt against the family as a concept. But just as easily you could say that this kind of monotonous and sterile self-pleasure was becoming utterly symbolic of the avant-garde's tilt towards narcissism. Indeed, lack of understanding technology would yield real-world consequences for most fields, but in art it was somehow open season. Tatlin's Tower is a model to be made into a building that was commissioned by the Communist International, who wanted a building that symbolized their constructivist and communist beliefs. It was never actually made into a building, because as it turns out, it was functionally impossible and made with no regard for the material reality. So if you want to talk about perfect symbolism for communism, this might be your dictionary definition. So there was this growing trend towards the artist being seen as this Gnostic bearer of knowledge, that we should all be eagerly awaiting for their shamanistic expositions on how the world ought to be. This is a particularly egregious example, where Ernst Ludwig Kirchner painted himself as a soldier returning home from the war, even though he served as a driver and never actually fighting as a soldier. In amputating his hands, this was to symbolize that this is the artist that was the soldier who could no longer serve, a Gnostic martyr. So this was an old school religiosity, religious instinct being plugged into whatever aesthetics were available at the moment. First it was technology, then it was the self becomes God. It was Carl Jung's fractionated individual. This was an arrogance that you really saw with the architects of the time, who audaciously declared themselves the master builders, holding the keys to the cosmopolitan future being unlocked, insofar as the dystopian and depressing buildings of their time were torn down in favor of their designs. They wrote a lot of grandiose manifestos about how everyone should just get out of their way so they can get these gold nuggets out of their head so the world could be launched into being a utopia sooner. Again, lots of fantastical designs that never actually got made, and sadly the ones that did get made brought real-world negative consequences. Corbusier, Van der Rohe, and Adolf Loos formed this cohort who advocated for clean geometry, sleek lines, and omitting of all ornamentation. Decoration of any kind was spoken about as if it was this backwards-minded, uncivilized, vestigial trait, likened to Homo erectus smearing their fecal matter officially on the wall, like being stuck at the anal stage of Freudian psychosocial development. What's most ironic is that these buildings are now seen as totally synonymous with the dystopian future they claim to be battling against. Placemaking studies seem to have solidified that people living in places like this have their mental states negatively impacted. Nonetheless, the seeds to a total wipeout of representation had been planted. I like to think of the official term from modernism to postmodernism as this moment from Robert Rauschenberg, who was professionally jealous of Willem de Kooning, so he bought a piece of his and furiously erased away at it until nothing but a blank canvas was in its wake, a familiar sight in contemporary art today. Ahab Hassan even calls postmodernism a vast will to unmaking, and by this point the modernist disquiet had seemingly been confirmed in catastrophe, with 2 world wars, the atom bombs, concentration camps, horrific human rights atrocities by totalitarian regimes, and now the ensuing Cold War. To mount a defense of culture, of humanism, to still create, was to tempt the same disasters happening again. The modernist project had failed publicly, and the human being had been exposed as monsters that could not be trusted. The concept of the human being had to be wiped off the face of the earth, effaced in Foucault's words. The representational artist, the realistic painter, was relegated to being a lower form of artist, their art dismissed as kitsch, as naive, skill splinters off into its own results-driven domains like graphic design and illustration. It's no longer considered fine art or high intellect. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image from Exodus 24 is a quote you'll see unironically used at a lot of art schools to deter you from depicting things, because to depict is to lie for nefarious gain, even if you didn't intend to. And there is some historical precedent in this, such as in the Orientalist paintings by Jean-Leon Jeremy, and realism being used for any kind of propagandistic purpose. There's a gap to the referent or signified that can never be bridged, because our human frailties will make it ugly or biased no matter what we do with it. In the same way painting the gods and the idols made them ugly, because we're relegating that which is from the higher planes of existence to our disgusting, filthy lower planes, and so we should just give up on that endeavor entirely. Conceptual art, on the other hand, was elevated as being the highest form of art for its pure distillation of ideas. Supposedly there stood no barriers between your perception and the idea itself. It's also considered more democratic for not forcing you to think of it in any one way. Your idea of it is the artwork itself.
The fact that it's not obvious and it's not like poking you in the face saying like this is what it is, it makes it better because you can put more thought into it.
It's your own interpretation.
Yeah.
It's not telling you what to think of it. It's what you think of it.
Art theorist Arthur Danto, upon seeing the Brillo boxes by Andy Warhol for the first time, these ready-made art objects, declares that this is the moment where art sheds itself of representation entirely, finally realizing what it's been all along: ideas, philosophy. Its mode of transportation less relevant than the ideas elicited themselves.
Why haven't you been doing the assignments?
My work has nothing to do with form or light or color, but with questioning the nature of aesthetic experience.
I'll buy that.
And therefore this was the official end of art according to Danto. What began with Immanuel Kant has now culminated in the realization that representation had never truly mattered. So the purest forms of art from here on out will cease dressing itself up to be anything other than that, be it in a textual definition of an image by Joseph Kosev or in the exploration of these phenomenal gaps. Post-structuralism was gaining intellectual clout at the time. The Death of the Author, written by Roland Barthes, challenged the notion that the human spirit can ever transcend cultural boundaries, also challenging whether or not the author could be this dominant meaning maker in their texts. For example, if you watched Mean Girls and you read it as an allegory for the Russian Revolution, you'd be considered totally valid, because any text that now claims to hold solid meaning is considered authoritarian or plugging into fascist instincts. The author of this piece here would not be the crafters of the chair, but rather Joseph Kosev for purchasing it and putting it in the gallery for your experience of it to be possible. Testing this idea to its limits would become a mandate in a lot of art schools, such as in my last art school. I was there for a year. I submitted these 2 pieces to a drawing module. The color pencil drawing on the left received the equivalent of a C and was criticized for its shielding itself from viewer participation and was therefore called close-minded, which I thought was totally ludicrous just because you could recognize what's supposed supposed to be in it doesn't mean that you're halted from negotiating meaning, or opposing it even in bell hooksian manner, whereas the piece on the right is a blank sheet of paper that I covered in glue stick and left on the floor in a public place to be stepped on organically. This received high praise for its psychogeographic derive and intellectual challenging of notions of place and authorship. I'm sure you guys know about Jeff Koons and Damien Hirst, but I think the most offensive example of this is with Sherry Levine, who took a photo of a photo originally by Walker Evans to subtract from his authorship. Under these pretenses, she managed to sell this photo of a photo at a gallery. Of course, there's also gas released into the air as art or outright invisible art. For some, even the Jackson Pollock style abstract painting or even the totally blank canvas was considered too cultured or cultivated. The contemporary artist Paul McCarthy says that painting as a medium was, quote, locked in the rectangle of the canvas. Out of all of the ways to elicit ideas, this was but one and archaic a mode. So by now we've officially arrived at the anti-representation hegemony in the fine art world, but for the critical theorist, even doing as little as possible was not enough. We actually had to destroy what came before under the guise of egalitarianism. Any standard considered rigid at all, be it beauty, professionalism, hard work, eloquence, being good at math even, were now all considered cultural constructs reified by some hegemonic oppressor class. The cis-heteronormative white supremacist patriarchal bourgeoisie class. Realism was seen as one such construct, but art in general was seen as the mode of queering the category in queer theorist terms, or deconstruction in Derridian terms. The Vladimir Lenin sentiment that if only the working classes realized just how bad they had it so they would rise up and take over was applied en masse, basically outlawing gratitude. Those we deemed to be oppressed had to be made to see just how oppressed they were, and if we couldn't do that, then any disruption or iconoclasm will be justified so long as it destroys the past, even if we didn't know what to build in its wake. Love, family, the hero myth, good manners even, etc., all whilst the taboo was elevated. All these artists would obviously hide behind a guise of egalitarianism or some emancipatory revolutionary spirit, but in practice what you get is people shitting into cans and calling it art. Petulant iconoclasm and nihilism. As much as I find artist shit quite funny, I highly doubt that this man cares for the proletariat revolution or instilling class consciousness amongst the peasants. Functionally, this is what post-structuralism gets you, and at its worst, you get Jörg Unterweger, who is a Austrian serial killer and rapist who, upon being jailed, started writing poetry, and so he was declared this neo-Kantian genius for his willingness to trespass moral boundaries. Thus, his poetry, his art, was the only real form of art. By drawing these lines between speaking well and being white, science with Eurocentrism, you end up patronizing the marginalized even more with these essentialist claims. If even realism, beauty, and representation in art are considered mere products of a taste-making cultural hegemony, then you end up with the galleries that you see today. The last time I walked into Manchester Art Gallery, I saw that most of the beautiful paintings of old were by the supposed hegemonic class, whilst the people of color and women were relegated to the contemporary section swirl of abstract trash. It's hardly a good look, and it also just doesn't work. The sociologist Pierre Bourdieu wrote in Distinction that the working classes still prefer realism, whilst the avant-garde pieces were preferred by the rich, who purchased these pieces to signal that they're not just in the financial elite, but in the intellectual elite as well. To dismiss people who don't get such avant-garde pieces as mere Philistines who lack the expensive liberal arts degree to help them get it is absurdly backwards. The lowered standards of skill play into the hands of the rich, who can now just commission craftspeople to make their ready-mades for them, or ring up their oligarch buddies to make sure their works never go unbidded for, in the much talked about continuation of this endless game of money laundering and tax evasion. Academia plays into their hands too when they mythologize and intellectualize these trends. So too does when a budding artist hides behind style, is willingly lazy, and succumbs to these egoistic, solipsistic, ascetic ideals, that which John Dewey warned us about many decades decades earlier. The elites of the past at least had to demonstrate some skill. The elites now only have to be rich. Skill at least stood in the way of this kind of thing devolving. Hilton Kramer, the art critic, blames the decline of skill on realism lacking a core intellectual argument compared to conceptual art, which has all of this moral gesticulation and even outright emotional blackmail. So I will now attempt to rebuttal the main thesis in conceptual art, namely this presupposition and automatic presumption of superiority based on its distillation of ideas.
When you're looking at simply a square of white paint, you have to do a lot more work, but sometimes there maybe is something more rewarding.
Ryman has reduced painting to its very essence. A lot of people don't understand that.
Firstly, you can so say that realistic painting can elicit universal truths and emotions far more powerfully than other mediums, insofar as the painting is strong enough. This is a painting of Ivan the Terrible having just killed his own son by accident. It is a painting that many say speaks to the feeling of regret far more powerfully than any other medium or piece has. Indeed, if you Google regret painting, this is the first thing to come up. And I do agree with these sentiments. I don't think you could capture this as powerfully in a photograph. You couldn't pose a model to create an expression as evocative as how Ivan was painted here by this artist. Of course, the conceptual artist will say that even this is too slanted and nowhere near as distilled as what they do, but that's only applicable a claim if you measure realistic painting with conceptual art standards, but not conceptual art with realistic paintings, because if you did it the other way around, you'll find that there are still many barriers in the way of this supposedly pure experience of the idea. How do we know that Tracy Emin's bed spoke best to depression when it's been hoisted out of its natural habitat, lit differently to how it would have looked if it were deliberately unmade? Then surely that's constructed. Even if it stayed looking exactly the same and being transported to the gallery, it's still a depiction of a bed that would have looked different in various other days. Why does this depiction deserve privileging over any other? Is that not a lie about the totality of existence of this bed? Is it not subjective that this depiction speaks best to depression? You basically never hear this argument swung in that direction, because for conceptual art to justify itself, it has to be that their distillation of ideas is superior, and that we all have to be measured by their choice of yardstick, when that could just be avoided and we could live harmoniously under one bigger fine art umbrella. We don't compare video to film, sound design to music, kung fu to guns, so why do these two get lumped together with one yardstick? It's forced precisely because conceptual art needs to justify itself from a place of insecurity.
It seems like she's trying to do something more than just draw herself. It's really more about the process of drawing.
Your drawing looks like it was done by a machine, whereas flowers is full of playfulness and yeah, like humanity.
Conceptual art doesn't get to be more meaningful or deep just because the idea is all they have. There's also this self-assured sense of novelty. Look at how critics talked about Marina Abramovich's The Artist is Present performance piece. They speak about it as if no one's ever thought of anything like this before, or that it was super impressive that she gruelingly sat there day after day. But you can contest all of this. It's been done before, many decades prior, and arguably more impressively if you're the type to be impressed by grueling self-punishment, that is. Chris Burden, for White Light, White Heat, hid himself in the ceiling crevice there for the duration of a show, for 22 days in a row without resting, keeping himself alive on nothing but celery juice. And because he hid himself and didn't force you to look at him, the only thing Marina has over his is an attention-seeking and succumbing to that which Dewey warned us about many decades prior. As for Paul McCarthy's performance pieces, they're really echoes of what you already saw with Jodorowsky many decades prior, and even Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, the urinal which you've all seen. That came a whopping half a century before the Brillo boxes by Andy Warhol, the supposed official end of art. And if you want to talk about discomfort, you can go even further back. Here's how Michelangelo painted the Sistine. Look how he stood up, stretched out to even touch the ceiling. He took 4 years painting this, and we didn't just get discomfort from it, but rather an artifact with staying power that we still talk about to this day. So conceptual art is nowhere near as novel and profound as it thinks it is. But every time they do something that's been done before, it's talked about as if it's the first time it's been done. We've been frozen in this kind of rhetoric for around 100 years now. Here's what Octavio Paz, the the poet, has to say about this. Today, modern art is beginning to lose its powers of negation, of critique. For some years now, its rejections have been ritual repetitions, rebellion has turned into procedure, and criticism into rhetoric. He said this in 1974, by the way. I hope we all agree that it's time to move on. With the financial elites pulling the strings out there, it's hard to give you this Churchillian statement on how you should go out there and change the landscape. But what we can at least do is get our own houses in order, sort it out on the level of the individual, our own Voltairean gardens, if you will. Just because the mass of artists out there has become impossible to respect, that doesn't mean we can't become respectable ourselves and start treating our own jobs with a level of dignity and sanctity again. We don't have to succumb to those lazy identity actualization habits. If we already occupy such a privileged role in society, and we add being annoying, egotistical, and show no subservience to an audience as well to boot, then you can hardly fault people for thinking you're non-essential. There also has been a quiet bubbling movement away from this compulsion towards solipsism and navel-gazing. This is a humorous piece called The Model's Reaction, which utilizes skill in an ironic and metatextual way, the kind of things that postmodern pieces think only postmodern pieces can do. I think the best way to denigrate any art style is to repeat it with ease whilst demonstrating your own prowess at the same time. There's also a general push towards placing the beauty of women defiantly back onto the canvas after the endurance testing that they've been put through last century. This is a painting by Cesar Santos where a nude model vandalizes a de Kooning piece, possibly the ultimate symbol of all female vandalization the last century. Humanity in general has also made a lot of progress since the doom and gloom of the last century. It was easy to be doom and gloom back then, with all that's happened, maybe even very justified, but we're still doom and gloom about it for some reason. Whilst progress is non-linear, and we've sometimes taken catastrophic backward steps, progress has definitely been made since life expectancy and standards of living have gone up. Whilst there are also drastic decreases in starvation and poverty, sexism, homophobia, racism, they're all far less of an issue today than they've been back then. And whilst there's a lot of fear-mongering, social attitudes have definitely changed. We have electric cars and advances in geoengineering that show promise when it comes to dealing with climate issues. We as a generation of young people have so much to look forward to. We could be thinking about going into space and colonizing Mars, for crying out loud. We could be thinking so big, but here we are wasting our bandwidth, arguing about gender pronouns and obsessing over our identities. Arthur Danto thinks that art is over. I think there are still many stories left to tell. Of course, humankind is messed up many a time. Realism has been used for shoddier purposes, but that doesn't make it this white Eurocentric artifact. We can use it better. We can make it more inclusive if we have to. Teach it to more people, allow more people to use it should they wish to. We can go again even after error, where once Icarus flew too close to the sun, we can take flight again, this time with our newfound knowledge, and land back down safely. If you look very closely, you can see the Christian symbolism. Elsewhere in literature and film, there's a metamodern shift towards a newer sincerity, be it in the hyper-distilled hero mythology in Everything Everywhere All at Once to the re-rescuing of the father in Civil War Land and Bad Decline. By returning to these values after the dire testing they've been put through, we demonstrate that they really are the highest of values and that they can withstand anything. This is what Jonathan Pajot calls the rediscovery of the sacred, a zombie religion he says that we should make room for. For those who want to continue in the footsteps of the old masters, the international kitsch movement may provide some solace. Where once kitsch was used as this pejorative and still is for representational art, Norwegian painter Odd Nerdrum comes along and reappropriates it positively, defiantly referring to himself as kitsch, to continue in normal service to ensure that the wisdoms and lessons from the forefathers never fade. If we have to drop the moniker of being an artist, then we will, so to say that we're not following the same schema of the contemporary artist, all because you think that I land my cast shadow in the right place, that I'm not an artist, then so be it. Perhaps I'm not an artist. If that's too posh or monocote for any of you, then there's also the stuckist movement. The stuckists aim to bring back modernism, but with a re-energized human spirit, making representational art that goes against the trend of ego art and anti-art. Their name also derived from an insult, this time given to them by Tracy Emin in one of her typically banshee-esque squealings about how they were stuck in their ways, and thus the stuck stuckists were born. The fine art world was doing everything it can to ignore their existence, but their protesting and artwork has actually drawn a lot of media coverage to the tax evasion and dodgy money dealings in the art world. So many great things are happening in and around the art industry at the moment. It's not all doom and gloom. Yes, the world's far from perfect. Racism and sexism still occur, but art skills are really just communication skills, and when you queer even your ability to communicate, then your ability to advocate for yourself, let alone for the marginalized, gets severely hamstrung. You saw throughout the presentation that as much as artists hide behind subjectivity and denigrate even science's ability to make a dent out there in the external objective reality, the world carries on regardless of your ignorance. That's why I like to believe that modernism never really ended, that this postmodern condition of solipsism is merely the result of not knowing enough about the world or how things worked. If you didn't understand science, it may as well sound like technobabble, it may as well be magic to you. To reduce even science to being contingent truths, totally reliant on arbitrary calculations and experimental models, is to neglect what science has achieved under that model. What would you have done in the 1940s when polio was about? Not taking penicillin, dismiss it as merely what was arbitrarily decided to be the best thing to take by scientific racists? I think we all know the answer there. And similarly, art and literature has made a dent out there in the external reality. Without Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, second-wave feminism doesn't attain political equal rights so soon. Without Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, the Soviet Union may not have fallen when it did. Without being hermetically sealed, art and language has made objective real-world impacts, oftentimes positive ones. These objective dynamics are consistently ignored by artists. Aesthetic studies demonstrate that people rank order pieces based on subject matter, composition, and beauty, as well as other metrics with very strong uniformity. The semantic differential, which is used by marketing firms to maneuver for their desired audience reception, is scarily effective, to the point where the CIA uses it, and it's formed the basis of our current AI models. So as much as theorists want to obsess over the death of the author and insist that the culture gets to decide what things mean, the culture has largely spoken on conceptual art. They don't like it, and yet we ignore them. I'm not saying that there's no room for conceptual art at all, but I think on the whole, they've been wrong about what art is. The word art comes from the word artifice. It's supposed to be constructed, created, cultivated, perhaps even contrived. It's a testament to our human species' use of tools to help them navigate their existence. Maybe it can't speak to the sublime, but I don't think it was ever meant to. To quote Karl Popper, the greatest thing about being a human being is the capacity to let our ideas die in place of us, and I think that's what art is. Arthur Danto thinks that art is all philosophy, and therefore christened Marcel Duchamp to being his philosopher king. But I think if people wanted philosophy, they'd read Aristotle or Buddha, and Duchamp is no Aristotle, having read a bit of both. Art can be philosophy, but art is also art, and it'll always be art. And not to throw out critical theory entirely, there are many useful ideas here if you don't take them to the extremes. Gilles Deleuze says that the "this is not a pipe" problem is not a real problem necessarily. If an image of a pipe is helping you live in the world, or is even making you happy, then it being an image is not a problem per se. Something being constructed doesn't negate its value as an experience necessarily. To posit any truth claim is obviously scary. You risk being wrong tomorrow every time you open your mouth today. Your actions can reflect in bravery or cowardice. And in art, aiming for beauty to represent things is daunting because you can fall and land on ugliness. But it's a much braver decision than playing off ugliness as choice or style. And that's the statement that deserves underscoring and symbolic capital to my view, far more than anything to do with nihilism. The pull of nihilism will always be there. We can all relate to nothing far easier than relating to something, because we've all been nothing. That's why the idea of a canon of great works is so threatening, especially to young people who have yet to really find themselves and become cultivated. Of course we'd be seduced by saying that the greats were not so great, or so-and-so is a racist, so they're therefore not worthy of being studied, or conveniently that everything is subjective anyways. I can't force anyone to not stay in their comfort bubble, and if their lazy, trite art ends up making them a lot of money like Andy Warhol did, then all the power to them. But the rest of us can widen our margins for success, it's also a very expensive skill to come here and not learn the rules before breaking them, to not know what your true potential is. We all have a blank canvas ahead of us. I hope we can do with it something brave and perhaps even beautiful. So thank you very much for listening, and that is all from me.